She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She didn't demand answers or collapse against the wall. Lucia Veresi simply stood in the hallway with 3 inches of open door between her and the rest of her life. And she looked. She saw the man she had chosen above everything. She saw the woman she had trusted since childhood. She saw tangled sheets and low lamplight and 2 people who had stolen something from her that no amount of money, power, or apology could ever return. Then she closed the door softly, like she was trying not to wake a sleeping child. She removed her engagement ring in the elevator going down, and she was never found. If this story already has your heart racing, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The night Lucia Veresi's life ended, it was raining in Milan. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain that arrives to announce catastrophe. Just a cold, indifferent drizzle that dampened the cobblestones and made the streetlights blur into pale smears of gold. She had been at a translation conference for 3 days, a small academic event hosted at a hotel near the Navigli canals, the kind of gathering where scholars argued in 4 languages over buffet dinners and drank bad Prosecco and told themselves they were doing important work. Lucia had presented a paper on Portuguese-Italian linguistic convergence. It had gone well. People had asked good questions. She had eaten dinner alone at a corner table and permitted herself to feel, briefly, proud. She took an early train home. Not because she missed Tommaso. She had learned in 2 years of being engaged to him that missing him was a dangerous indulgence. He was not the kind of man who inspired longing safely. He inspired it the way a fire inspired warmth. You could sit close and feel wonderful, but lean too far and you would burn. She took the early train because she was tired of hotel pillows, and she wanted her own bed, and though she would not have admitted it to anyone at that conference, she wanted to smell his cologne on the sheets. That was the embarrassing human truth of it. She just wanted to be home. The apartment was on the 6th floor of a building in the Brera district, the kind of building that had a doorman named Enrico who knew better than to ask questions about the men who visited at odd hours and the packages that were never opened at the front desk. Lucia had moved in 8 months ago, when Tommaso had said it was safer. She had not asked what she needed to be kept safe from. That was another thing she had learned. Some questions in his world were doors you were better off not opening. She rode the elevator up alone. She was carrying a leather satchel and a paper bag with 2 cornetti she'd bought at a station kiosk, planning to leave them on the counter for morning. She was thinking about a shower. She was thinking about sleeping until 10. She was, in every meaningful sense, not prepared. The apartment door was unlocked. She noticed this the way you notice a small wrongness, the kind your brain processes before your body reacts, a half-second of static before the signal resolves. Tommaso was careful about locks. It was nearly pathological, actually, the way he checked them, 3 times before bed, always. She had teased him about it once, and he had looked at her with those flat, dark eyes and said simply, "People die because they forget to lock doors." And she had never teased him about it again. She stepped inside. The apartment was dim, the kind of dark that meant the bedroom lamp was on and casting its light under the closed door. She could hear music, low, something instrumental. And she could hear something else beneath the music, something her brain refused, in the first 3 seconds, to correctly identify. She set her satchel down on the hall table without thinking. She set the paper bag beside it. She walked down the hallway in her damp coat and her sensible conference shoes, and she was almost to the bedroom door before she understood what the sound was. She pushed it open 3 inches. That was enough. Later, months later, years later, in moments she could not suppress even when she tried, she would think about what it meant that she had not pushed it all the way. 3 inches. The rational part of her brain, even in that moment, had understood that 3 inches was sufficient, that more information would not help her, that what she had already seen was enough to end everything that had existed before it. Tommaso Silvestri was in the bed. So was Valentina Veresi, her sister. Lucia had 3 siblings. She was the second oldest. Valentina was the youngest, 24 years old, the one who had always been beautiful in the effortless, infuriating way that made people forgive her for things they wouldn't forgive anyone else. The one who borrowed money she never returned and called it love. The one who cried with such convincing despair at family dinners that their mother always ended up comforting her, never noticing who had actually caused the damage. Lucia had defended her for years. That was the part that was going to take the longest to get over. Not Tommaso's betrayal, though that was its own specific devastation, but the fact that she had spent years building arguments for why Valentina was worth defending. She stood in the hallway for 11 seconds. She counted later, reconstructed the timeline with the obsessive precision of someone who had nothing left to do but replay a single moment endlessly. 11 seconds of standing very still with her hand still on the door, feeling the light from the crack fall across her shoes, listening to the music and the sounds beneath it, and then making a decision so quiet it barely registered in her own body. She walked back to the hall table. She opened her satchel. She found a pen. She found the back of a conference program. She wrote 2 words. I saw. She placed the engagement ring on top of it, the ring Tommaso had presented to her with his characteristic lack of ceremony, sliding it across a restaurant table like a document requiring her signature, and then watching her with something that might have been vulnerability if you caught it in the right light. A 3-carat oval diamond in a plain platinum setting. Beautiful and cold, like most things he chose. She placed the ring. She picked up her satchel. She did not take the cornetti. She rode the elevator down. She nodded to Enrico, who was half asleep at his desk, and did not notice that she had arrived 20 minutes ago. She walked out into the rain. She turned left instead of right, away from the taxi stand she always used, and she walked until she found a different street, a different cab, a driver who did not recognize her and would not remember her. She told him to take her to the central train station, and she sat in the back seat with her satchel in her lap and her hands very still, and her face doing something complicated that she did not allow herself to examine until the driver could not see her in the rearview mirror. Then she pressed her forehead against the cold window, and she let herself have 30 seconds of falling apart. 30 seconds. She counted those too. Then she straightened up and started thinking about where to go. She had 1 credit card in her own name. It had a limit of 4,000 euros on it, because Tommaso had suggested early in their relationship that she let him handle her finances, and she had agreed, and this particular card was the one she'd kept because it was connected to a translation contract she'd signed before she ever met him, and she had simply forgotten to mention it. She understood now, sitting in the train station at 2 in the morning and looking at departure boards, that forgetting had been an act of self-preservation she hadn't been conscious enough to plan. She bought a ticket to Zurich, not because she had any particular reason to go to Zurich, but because it left in 40 minutes, and she had heard somewhere that it was difficult to find people in Switzerland if they did not want to be found. She did not know if this was true. She bought the ticket anyway. On the train, she sat in an empty car and looked out the window at nothing and tried to take stock of what she had. A satchel, a laptop, a notebook with conference notes, 2 changes of clothes, a cosmetics bag, 4,000 euros and a credit card she would need to stop using as soon as possible because Tommaso Silvestri had connections inside every financial institution in northern Italy, and she knew, with the particular clarity that comes from paying very close attention to a powerful man's habits, that tracing a credit card was not complicated if you knew who to ask. She had her professional credentials. She was a certified translator in 5 languages: Italian, English, Portuguese, French, and a working competency in German that she was always slightly embarrassed by because she knew her accent was atrocious. She could find work. Not the kind of work she'd had, a faculty position, a research profile, a publication record, but work that could be done quietly, under a different name, in a different country. She had her mind. She had her discipline. She had 30 seconds of falling apart already spent and no intention of spending more. What she did not have: a plan beyond the next 12 hours, a place to sleep tomorrow night, a single person she could call who was not in some way connected to either Tommaso's world or her family. She stared at her phone for a long time. Then she opened her contacts and scrolled through years of accumulated names and understood for the first time how thoroughly she had allowed her life to be absorbed into his. Colleagues who had attended the engagement party he'd thrown, friends who had become friends with his people, her mother, who adored him, her sister. She closed the contact list. She turned her phone off. Outside the window, Milan's outskirts gave way to dark countryside, And she watched it pass, and she did not allow herself to think about the look on his face the first time he told her he loved her, which he had said only once, on a night she still thought about more than she should. She did not allow herself to think about that. She allowed herself to think, instead, about Portuguese coastal towns she had visited for research 3 years ago, places she had noted in the back of a notebook with the thought that someday she would go back when she had more time. She had time now. All of it. Tommaso Silvestri woke up at 6:15 as he always did, regardless of what had happened the night before. His body had been trained for decades to treat sleep as a transaction, a fixed number of hours purchased nightly, no more, no less. And this morning was no different. He registered the other person in the bed without looking at her. Then he looked. Valentina Verisi was asleep with her hair across the pillow and her face slack and innocent in the way that sleep makes everyone innocent, even people who aren't. He registered this too, without the feeling he'd expected to feel. There had been a time, approximately 6 hours ago, when the particular logic of too much whiskey and her particular proximity had seemed sufficient justification. At 6:15 in the morning, it did not seem sufficient. It seemed like the specific kind of stupidity that powerful men committed when they were so accustomed to consequences yielding to their will that they forgot consequences were real. He got up, he dressed. He walked to the kitchen to start the coffee. He saw the paper bag from the train station kiosk on the hall table first. Then he saw the ring. Then he saw the 2 words. He stood very still for approximately the same 11 seconds that Lucia had stood still in the hallway, but for entirely different reasons. Hers had been the stillness of someone absorbing damage. His was the stillness of someone recognizing, for the first time in years, that they had made an error that could not be corrected by leverage or money or force of will. He read the 2 words again. I saw. He looked at the ring, the oval diamond in its cold platinum setting. He had picked it out alone because he had believed at the time that asking for her input on the ring was a form of weakness, that a man who knew what he wanted did not need to consult anyone on the matter. She had worn it without complaint. She had never once told him she would have chosen something different. He understood now, looking at it on the conference program, that she had probably wanted something completely different and had decided it wasn't worth the argument, which meant she had been managing him, quietly and patiently, for longer than he'd realized, which meant he had not known her as well as he'd believed, which meant everything he had built his sense of certainty on was made of glass. He picked up the ring. He did not wake Valentina. He walked to the window and looked out at the rain-wet street below, and he thought for exactly as long as it took to finish the thought that Lucia Verisi was the most intelligent woman he had ever been in proximity to, and that he had spent the last 2 years quietly taking for granted what that intelligence had done for him. The stability she provided, the judgment she exercised, the way she could walk into any room in any country and navigate it because she understood instinctively how language worked and how people worked, and how the gap between what people said and what they meant was where all the actual information lived. He thought about what she had not done. She had not screamed. She had not confronted him. She had not called her family or his people or anyone. She had simply removed herself from the equation with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been thinking about exit strategies longer than he knew. He called her phone. The line was dead. He stood at the window for a very long time. The rain had stopped. Below, the street was beginning to fill with morning. Delivery trucks, commuters, the ordinary motion of a world that did not know anything had shifted. He put the ring in his jacket pocket. He called his head of security. "Find her," he said. It took them 6 hours to establish that she was not at her parents' home, not at the university, not at any hotel in Milan, or at any of the 3 addresses they had for her remaining friends. It took them 12 hours to find the CCTV footage of her leaving the building and getting into a taxi. It took them another 8 hours to find the taxi driver, who remembered a woman in a damp coat, satchel in her lap, forehead against the window, who had asked to be taken to the train station. Beyond that, nothing. The credit card had been used once, at a kiosk near Track 14 at Milano Centrale, at 2:43 in the morning. Then it went dark. Valentina had woken up and dressed and left the apartment without speaking. They had not discussed what had happened. Tommaso had not been in the room when she walked out. and he had not followed her, and she had not looked for him. And that particular silence between them was, in its own way, a complete conversation that neither of them wanted to have. In the weeks that followed, he turned his organization toward finding her with a focus that his lieutenants privately found alarming and publicly found impossible to question. Resources were redirected, contacts were tapped, a private investigator with an international network was given a retainer that made his other clients look like hobbies. Tommaso did not explain this to anyone. He did not owe explanations. He ran his empire, attended his meetings, made his decisions, and spent the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, the hours he could not fill with work, sitting in the apartment that still smelled faintly of her perfume and reading the case reports that produced nothing. He learned, in the absence of her, things he had not known he didn't know. He had not known that the apartment was quiet without her in it. Not physically quiet, but fundamentally quiet, the way a space is quiet when its center of gravity has been removed. He had not known that he had become accustomed to the sound of her typing at the desk in the corner, translating contracts at odd hours because her brain worked better late. He had not known that the particular quality of her attention, the way she listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually listening, tracking everything, filing it, was something he had been drawing on without realizing it. Without her in the room, his thinking had a quality like a tool that needed sharpening. He had not known any of this. He had believed in the comfortable arrogance of a man who had never been truly left by anyone, that she was a constant, that she was simply there, the way certain things were simply there. The building, the sky, the careful architecture of a life constructed around power and certainty. She was not simply there. She was gone. And he was beginning to understand slowly and with the particular agony of someone unused to understanding anything slowly, the specific magnitude of what he had thrown away. Zurich lasted 3 weeks. Lucia found a room above a laundromat in a neighborhood near the university, rented from a landlord who accepted cash and asked nothing. She found a translation agency that operated online and paid in transfers to an account she opened under her maiden name. She worked 16-hour days because work was the only thing that prevented her from conducting, in the remaining hours, the kind of internal inquiry she was not ready for. She bought a cheap phone. She did not call her mother. She called no one. She was 4 weeks out of Milan when her body told her something she was not expecting. She counted the weeks twice. Then she found a pharmacy and stood in the single-toilet bathroom of a cafe near the train station, and she looked at 2 lines on a plastic stick, and she sat down on the closed toilet lid, and she had exactly 12 minutes of what could only be described as total structural failure. The kind of crying that has no dignity to it, that is just the body expressing, in the only language bodies have, a grief too large for any other medium. 12 minutes. Then she stood up. Then she washed her face. Then she went back to her room above the laundromat, and she sat at her laptop and she looked at coastal towns in Portugal. She had always liked Cascais. She had spent 4 days there once, researching a paper on maritime trade language, staying in a guest house near the harbor, eating sardines with her laptop open and the window facing the Atlantic. She had thought, in that uncomplicated way of people who do not yet know what complications are coming, I could live here. She bought a train ticket. She left Zurich before the landlord could wonder where she'd gone. The months that followed were the hardest things she had ever done, and she had grown up in a family with a difficult father and a complicated mother and a sister who understood early that attention was a resource to be competed for, so her baseline for difficult was not low. She found a room in a guest house outside Cascais, in a village called Malveira da Serra, run by a woman named Dona Beatriz, who was 70 and deaf in one ear and profoundly incurious about other people's business, which made her, at that particular moment, the ideal landlord. Lucia paid 3 months in advance. She began taking Portuguese translation contracts under the name Lucia Marques, her mother's family name, 2 generations back, the kind of detail that surfaces when you are looking for somewhere to hide that is also, in some complicated way, true. She was careful. She did not use her real surname. She did not contact anyone from her previous life. She did not look at news from Italy because news from Italy might contain his name, and his name was a thing she was not capable of encountering without cost. She discovered that she was carrying twins at an appointment in a clinic in Lisbon, delivered by a doctor who was professionally detached and therefore bearable. She sat in the waiting room afterward with the ultrasound image in her hand, and she calculated, not for the first time and not for the last time, the precise distance between the life she was living and the life she had expected to be living, and she understood that the distance was not something that could be bridged. It could only be accepted. She accepted it. Leonardo and Matteo arrived in October, 2 months early and both perfectly fine, screaming into the world with the insistent urgency of people who have been waiting long enough. She labored alone, with Donna Beatrice in the waiting room outside, knitting something indefinable and muttering at a magazine. The midwife was a practical, competent woman who did not ask about the father, and Lucia did not offer. She lay in the narrow hospital bed afterward with one son on each arm. Leonardo on the left, already looking around with an expression of focused assessment that reminded her, with a physical blow she was not prepared for, of his father. And she made a decision she would spend years second-guessing and ultimately defending. She would not tell Tommaso. Not out of cruelty, not out of punishment, though she was not yet at the stage where she could be honest about how much punishment she wanted to give him, but because bringing him into their lives meant bringing his world into their lives, and his world was a place where people used leverage, and the people you loved became leverage. And she had seen enough in 2 years beside him to understand that the warmth of his protection and the danger of his world were the same thing, inseparable, a package that could not be divided. She would not raise her sons in that world. She would raise them here, in this village above the Atlantic, in this guest house room that smelled of salt and old wood, on translation contracts and stubbornness, and the particular love of a mother who has decided that wanting to keep her children safe is sufficient justification for anything. She believed that. She had to believe that. 5 years passed. They lived in 3 places: Malvera da Serra for the first 2 years, then a flat in Cascais proper, then a house they rented at the edge of the town, white walls and a small garden and a gate that squeaked when you opened it in a way that Lucia had been meaning to oil for 6 months. Leonardo could tell you the name of every bird that used the garden fence as a landing strip. Matteo had worked out, at age 4, that the gate squeak pattern changed depending on the wind direction, and had spent an entire afternoon testing this theory, reporting his findings to his mother with the gravity of a scientist presenting at a conference. She was happy. Improbably, incompletely, with the specific texture of happiness that people build from scratch rather than inheriting, but genuinely, functionally happy in the way that matters. She had colleagues she liked. She had a regular table at a cafe near the harbor. She had 2 sons who were loud and curious and occasionally maddening and completely, utterly hers. She did not think about Tommaso every day anymore. She thought about him on certain evenings, when the light fell in a particular way, or when Leonardo looked up from whatever he was doing with an expression so familiar it made her chest constrict. She thought about him when she sat alone after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, and she allowed herself, briefly and in full privacy, to remember what it had been like in the early period, before she understood what she was involved in, before she had learned to read the silences and the absences and the locked rooms, to simply be with him. The early months, when she had still been surprised by him, when he had still been capable of surprising her. She thought about him. Then she stopped. Then she made coffee and went back to work, because coffee and work were reliable in ways that memory was not. Tamko. The man who came to Cascais in October of the 5th year did not look like someone running a surveillance operation. He looked like a tourist, middle-aged, forgettable, the kind of man who takes photographs of seagulls and consults maps openly on street corners. He sat in the cafe near the harbor every morning for 4 mornings and drank espresso and read a local newspaper and did not appear to be watching anything. He was watching everything. On the 4th morning, he watched a woman with dark hair and a satchel over one shoulder walk past with 2 small boys, one on each side of her. The boys were arguing about something with the focused intensity of people for whom argument was a primary mode of engagement. The woman was listening to both of them simultaneously, which appeared to be a skill she had developed of necessity. She was laughing at something the smaller boy said. Her laugh was exactly as he had been told it would be. He took a photograph. He sent it to a man in Rome. The man in Rome looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the 2 small faces in the image. Then he sat very still for a period that alarmed the person in the room with him, who understood that the quality of this stillness was not peace. He said 2 words. Get the car. That. Tommaso arrived in Cascais on a Tuesday evening, alone except for 2 men who were paid not to be seen and were good at it. He checked into a hotel under a name that was not his. He did not eat dinner. He sat in the hotel room until midnight, and then he sat there a little longer, and the person he had been 5 years ago would not have recognized this behavior as belonging to him. The stillness, the restraint, the absence of immediate action. The person he had been 5 years ago had been someone who moved through the world on the assumption that his wants were entitled to immediate satisfaction. That person had made a mistake in a bedroom in Milan that had rearranged the structure of his entire life, and the 5 years since had been, among other things, an extended education in the gap between what he wanted and what he deserved. He slept badly. He woke early. In the morning, he found a position on a hill above the town where he could observe the street below without being observed. He had a coffee and a thermos. He had a pair of field glasses that his driver found embarrassing. He waited. She came out of the White House with the squeaking gate at 7:45, 1 boy on each side of her, the boys in school uniforms and backpacks, and some kind of ongoing debate that had apparently begun indoors and followed them into the street. She was wearing a dark green coat, and her hair was shorter than he remembered, and she moved the way she had always moved, with the particular efficiency of a person who has a great deal to do and no intention of wasting time. He watched her walk her sons to school. He watched her come back alone. He watched her for 3 days. On the 4th day, he was sitting on a bench near the harbor, coffee in hand, watching nothing in particular, when the 2 boys came running along the waterfront ahead of their mother and the larger one, Leonardo, he had determined, the one who had inherited his own habit of looking at a room like he was cataloging threats, stopped 6 feet away and stared at him with an expression of frank assessment that made something in Tommaso's chest do something he was not prepared for. "Mama says we shouldn't talk to strangers at the harbor," Leonardo said. "That's good advice," Tommaso said. "You have the same nose as me," Leonardo said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that this kind of observation is considered unusual. Tommaso looked at him. "I know," he said. He said it very quietly. Leonardo considered this for a moment, then his brother grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, because the mother was 3 seconds behind them, and they ran on, and when Lucia rounded the corner and saw the man on the bench, she stopped as if she had walked into glass. The harbor noise continued. A gull cried somewhere. The light off the water was very bright and cold. Lucia Marquez, for 5 years in this town, to everyone who knew her, stood 10 feet away from Tommaso Silvestri and looked at him with an expression that was not the expression he had imagined in the 5 years he'd spent preparing for this moment. He had imagined anger. He had imagined grief. He had imagined, on his worst nights, a blankness that would tell him she had excised him so completely that there was nothing left to feel. What he saw instead was the particular expression of someone who has been bracing for an impact they always knew was coming and has arrived at the moment of impact and has discovered that all the bracing in the world does not actually make it hurt less. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was steady. He had known it would be. "I know," he said. "How long have you been watching us?" 4 days. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not quite. A kind of resigned recognition. "Of course. 4 days. You would want to know everything before you moved." "Lucia, don't." The word came out quiet and absolute, the way she'd always delivered her most important statements. Not loud, not theatrical, just final. "Don't say my name like that. Don't show up here after 5 years and stand in front of my son's school and say my name like we're picking up from somewhere. I'm not here to take anything from you. You don't get to tell me what you're here to do. Not here. Not in front of them." She glanced at the boys, who had stopped 20 feet down the harbor path and were watching with the intense focus of children who understand that something important is happening but have not yet been given the vocabulary for it. "We're going to walk away now, and you're going to let us go. And when they're at school tomorrow morning, I will meet you at the cafe near the clock tower, and you will hear what I have to say. And then you will understand something about what happens next." She did not wait for him to agree. She walked to her sons, and she took each of them by the hand, and she walked away along the harbor without looking back. And Tommaso sat on the bench and watched her go, and understood that he was not dealing with the woman he had taken for granted 5 years ago. He was dealing with someone who had been remade by what he'd done to her. And he did not yet know, sitting in the cold October light of a Portuguese harbor, what that meant for him. What he did know, what had settled in him with the finality of something that cannot be unsaid, was this: his sons were real. They were real, and they existed, and they were walking away from him holding their mother's hands. And one of them had his nose, and the other had his jaw, and both of them had the particular quality of attention he recognized because he had lived with it all his life and had always believed it was only his. He had a family. He had spent 5 years looking for the woman he had wronged. And somewhere in those 5 years, without his knowledge, without his presence, without anything from him at all except his blood and his face, his family had already begun. He sat on the bench until the three of them disappeared around a corner. Then he put his face in his hands. Then he straightened up because he was Tommaso Silvestri, and he did not allow himself more than a moment of anything. And he took out his phone, and he made a call, and he said 7 words that contained in the compressed language of a man who had spent 5 years becoming someone slightly different than he had been before. Something has found us. Keep the boys safe. He did not know yet that the same facial recognition system that had located Lucia had flagged her presence to another set of eyes. Eyes that belonged to men who had spent 5 years waiting for exactly this kind of information. He did not know that the Calabrese family had been watching him watch her. He did not know that a car had parked on the hill above the town 3 days ago and that the men inside it were not tourists. He did not know yet, but he was about to. The cafe near the clock tower opened at 7:30, and Lucia was there at 7:32, which meant she had been waiting outside in the cold before the owner unlocked the door, and she had let herself be the first person inside because she needed the 2 minutes alone at the table to arrange herself before he arrived. She ordered an espresso she didn't want. She wrapped both hands around the small cup and looked at the door and waited. He came in at 7:45 exactly when she expected him. He had always been precise about time. It was one of the things she had admired about him early on, before she understood that precision was a form of control, and control was the only language he was fluent in. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, and he looked like he had not slept, which gave her no satisfaction, though she had anticipated that it might. He sat across from her without asking if the seat was available. "You found us," she said. "Yes." "How long did it take?" He looked at her steadily. 5 years. She absorbed this, set the espresso cup down. "You've been looking since the beginning." Since the morning. She had not expected that answer to do anything to her, and it did something to her, which she filed away and did not permit herself to examine in front of him. "That's not my problem, Tommaso." "I know." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Agree with everything. It's a tactic." She looked at him across the small table with the particular attention she had developed in 5 years of being alone and honest with herself. "You used to do it in the early days. When you wanted something and you weren't sure I would give it to you, you'd go quiet and agreeable and let me feel like I was controlling the conversation." Something shifted in his face. "You always did see it." "I always did. I just kept deciding it was worth accepting." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me what you want." "I want to know my sons." The words landed flat and plain in the space between them. She had been bracing for something more elaborate, some construction of argument and leverage and carefully positioned vulnerability. The plainness of it was almost worse. "You don't get to want that," she said. "Wanting something is not the same as having a right to it." "I know the difference." "I'm not sure you do." She kept her voice level, which cost her something. "You built your entire life on the assumption that wanting something hard enough was sufficient to deserve it. That's what your world runs on. That's what you run on." "I've changed." "Everyone says that. Not everyone means it. And you do." She looked at him. "Convince me." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him decide against the easy version of the answer, the version that listed evidence and accomplishments and demonstrated change, and instead he said, "I can't. Not in this conversation, not in this cafe. That's the thing I've had to understand, Lucia, that I don't get to convince you, I only get to show you over time, And I don't get to choose how long that takes. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a good answer, she said finally. It's an honest one. Same question applies. She picked up the espresso, drank the rest of it in one swallow, set the cup down. The boys don't know about you. They know they have a father. I didn't lie to them about that. I told them their father lived somewhere else and that it was complicated. Leonardo asked me 3 months ago if complicated meant you didn't want us. Her voice didn't change on this. She had practiced keeping it level. I told him it was more complicated than that. Tommaso said nothing. He looked at me the way you look at people when you know they're not giving you the whole answer and you're deciding whether to push, she said. He's 5 years old. He already does that. So you understand what I'm dealing with. He gets that from you. He gets that from both of us. And it's going to be a significant problem when he's 15. She stood up. You can meet them. On my terms, on my schedule, and only if they want to. And you need to understand that this does not mean anything has changed between us. Not one thing. You are the father of my children. That's it. That's all you are to me right now. I understand. Do you? Yes. She studied him. Why do I not believe you? Because you're smart, he said, and because being smart around me has historically required not believing me. She looked at him for 3 more seconds, then she pulled on her coat and picked up her satchel. I'll bring them to the harbor park on Saturday at 10. You'll be there. You will not touch them unless they initiate it. You will not say anything about the past, about Italy, about any of it. You are a man named Tommaso who knows their mother. That's the introduction. We build from there, or we don't build at all. She walked to the door. Lucia. She stopped but didn't turn. Thank you, he said. She pushed the door open and walked out into the cold morning air and did not let herself feel anything about those 2 words until she was half a block away and the cafe door had swung shut behind her. Then she allowed herself to feel them for exactly the length of time it took to walk to the corner. Then she turned and walked to school pickup. Saturday arrived with the sky the color of steel wool and a wind off the Atlantic that had no interest in being tolerated. Lucia dressed the boys in their heaviest coats, and they argued about hats. Leonardo consenting to a beanie under protest, Matteo refusing categorically until she pointed out that the wind would bother him more than the hat would, at which point he put it on with the expression of someone making a tactical concession. And they walked down to the harbor park at 9:58. Tommaso was already there. He was standing near the iron railing at the park's edge, looking out at the water, and he heard the gate squeak and turned, and Lucia watched his face do something when he saw them coming. Something she recognized because she had seen it happen maybe 3 times in 2 years, and he had always looked away quickly so she wouldn't see it. A kind of unwilled openness, the expression a person makes before they've had time to arrange their face into something more defensible. He arranged it quickly, but not quickly enough. The boys stopped beside her. Leonardo looked at him with the direct assessment that was apparently a genetic trait requiring no cultivation. Matteo looked at his mother, then at the man, then at his mother again, executing the calculation of a child who needs more data before committing. This is Tommaso, Lucia said. He's someone I knew a long time ago. In Italy? Leonardo asked. He had retained, somewhere in the information his mother had managed to give him while giving him almost nothing, the fact that she was from Italy. Yes, Lucia said. In Italy. Leonardo looked at Tommaso. You have the same nose as me, he said. I saw you at the harbor before. I remember, Tommaso said. Mama said we were going to meet you. Did she tell you anything else? She said to be normal. Leonardo appeared to consider whether he was being normal and concluded that he was. Matteo thinks you might be our father. Lucia closed her eyes briefly. Matteo, presented with this disclosure, did not look abashed. He looked at Tommaso with the expression of someone who has put forward a hypothesis and is waiting for confirmation or denial. Tommaso crouched down so he was at their level. It was a thing he had never done in his life, crouching down for anyone, and it felt strange in his knees and stranger everywhere else. And he looked at these 2 5-year-old faces that were his own face at a distance, and he said, "Yeah, I am." The silence that followed was occupied entirely by Matteo processing this and Leonardo deciding how he felt about it. Why didn't you live with us? Leonardo asked. Not angry. Factual. The tone of a child who wants the actual information. I made a mistake, Tommaso said. A big one. Your mother needed to be somewhere safe, and I wasn't safe to be around. Lucia felt something move through her chest at that. Not forgiveness. Something prior to forgiveness. An acknowledgement that he had given the right answer to a question she hadn't had the chance to prep him for. Are you safe now? Matteo asked. Tommaso looked at him. I'm trying to be. That's not the same as yes, Leonardo pointed out. No, Tommaso said. It's not. Leonardo appeared to find this acceptable. He looked at his brother. Some communication passed between them in the manner of twins that did not require language. Then he looked back at Tommaso. Okay, he said. It was the most provisional okay Tommaso had ever received in his life. It was also the most important. The Saturday visits became a fixture. Tommaso rented a flat in Cascaie, not close to Lucia's house, a deliberate distance, a courtesy he didn't explain and she didn't ask about. He showed up when he said he would. He left when he said he would. He did not push for more. He learned, over the following weeks, that Leonardo liked birds with a focused intensity that had produced a notebook with pencil drawings of 37 species identified in and around Cascais, annotated with observation notes in a handwriting that was very small and very neat. He learned that Matteo was conducting an ongoing engineering project involving the construction of a functional water routing system in the garden using salvaged pipe fittings, and that this project had a completion timeline and a budget and was presented to interested parties in a manner that suggested he had independently reinvented the concept of project management. He sat on the floor with them. He listened. He asked questions and listened to the answers and did not redirect the conversation toward himself, which was a practice that required more active effort than he had expected. Lucia watched this from a careful distance and said very little. What she did, because she was Lucia and incapable of not doing it, was notice everything. She noticed that he always arrived slightly early and waited rather than buzzing early. She noticed that he remembered which bird Leonardo had been excited about last time and asked about it first. She noticed that when Matteo's water routing project hit a structural problem, Tommaso had spent 45 minutes on the floor of the garden with a pipe fitting and a piece of notebook paper, working through the load distribution with him, not solving it for him, working through it together, which was not a thing she had ever seen him do with another person. She noticed all of this. She was not ready to know what to do with any of it. The day it broke open was a Thursday, 3 weeks into this careful arrangement, when she came home from a cafe meeting with a client to find the gate not just unlatched, but standing open and the garden empty in a way that was immediately wrong because Matteo's project materials were scattered in the grass, as if they had been dropped rather than set down. She went inside. The house was quiet. She called both boys' names. Nothing. She checked each room in the 13 seconds it takes to check a small house and found it empty, and then she was back in the garden, and her phone was in her hand and she was calling the school, not because the boys should be there, they'd been home since 3, but because the school had an emergency contact list and she needed someone to call who wasn't Tommaso. Then she called Tommaso. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting for a call, which meant he already knew something. Where are they? She said. Not a question. Safe. His voice was controlled in the specific way that meant he was managing his own fear by applying pressure to it from the outside. They're with Marco. He has them 2 streets over. They're fine. What happened? A car. It was parked outside your house this morning when I came by. I recognized the plates. I got the boys out through the back before you got home. The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the October air. Calabrese, she said. Silence. Tommaso. Yes. She sat down on the garden step. The pipe fittings were scattered in the grass in front of her. How long have they known where we are? I don't know exactly. Long enough. Did they follow you here? A beat of silence that was its own kind of answer. Did they follow you here? She said again, each word separate and quiet. I took precautions. That's not what I asked. Lucia, I left everything. Her voice was not loud. It had never needed to be loud to carry. I left my name and my career and my family and my country, and I built something here that had nothing to do with your world, And I kept my children out of it for 5 years, and now you're telling me that your world found us anyway because you came here. If I hadn't come here, he said, and then he stopped. What? If I hadn't come here, they would have found you anyway. The same system that found you for me found you for them. They've been watching my search. They've known you existed for months. My coming here didn't create the risk. It just moved up the timeline. She sat with this. She could find the flaw in the argument. She was capable of finding the flaw in the argument, but she was also honest enough in the part of her that operated beneath anger and fear to recognize that it was not entirely wrong. "Where are my sons?" she said. "I'll take you to them." "No, tell me where they are, and I will go to them myself." A pause. "Via do Recreo, number 11. Marco is a good man, Lucia. He won't." She hung up. She walked to Via do Recreo without running, because running would have cost her more than she had to spend right now, and she needed everything she had left. Number 11 was a blue door. She knocked. A man who was not large but had the specific stillness of someone trained to be still opened it and looked at her and stepped back without speaking, and she walked past him into a bright kitchen where her sons were sitting at a table with a plate of biscuits and a deck of cards, engaged in what appeared to be an extremely competitive game of something. "Mama," Matteo said, looking up with the expression of someone who has been having a reasonably interesting afternoon and is now wondering if it's over. Leonardo looked at her with his father's eyes and said, "Are we in trouble?" "No," she said. "We're going home." "Marco is going to show us how to play brisca," Leonardo said. "Another time." She took them each by a hand. She looked at Marco, who had the sense not to say anything. She walked them out the blue door and down Via do Recreo toward home, and she held their hands the entire way, and she did not speak, and neither did they, because they were her children, and they had learned, not because she taught it, but because they'd inherited it, that there were moments when the most important thing was to be quiet and walk. Tommaso was standing outside her gate when they arrived. She stopped 6 feet from him. The boys looked at him and then at her. "Go inside," she told them. "Shoes off at the door. Matteo, your project materials are in the garden. Leave them until tomorrow." They went. The gate squeaked shut behind them. She stood in the street and looked at Tommaso Silvestri, and for the first time since the harbor she allowed her face to do exactly what it needed to do, which was to show him, without language, without management, without the careful architecture she had built to keep him at the correct distance, exactly what she felt. "I'm not going to run again," she said. "I know. Not because of you, because they're 5 years old and they're settled here, and I'm not going to make them leave because someone else can't manage his own enemies." "Fair. But I need you to understand something." She stepped closer, which was not a concession, but an insistence. "If anything happens to them, if one hair, Tommaso, one, I will not forgive you. Not for Milan, not for this, not for any of it. You understand?" He met her eyes. "Yes." "And I need you to tell me the truth right now. Is this going to get worse before it gets better?" He looked at her for a moment, not evasively, not strategically, just looking at her the way a person looks at another person when they're deciding to stop performing and say the actual thing. "Yes," he said. She had known he would say that. She had asked anyway because she needed him to say it plainly, without softening, without the diplomatic architecture that men like him constructed around bad news. She had needed him to just hand it to her straight. "Okay," she said. She turned and went inside. He stood at the gate in the dark for a moment, and then his phone buzzed, and he looked at the screen, and what he saw on it made the cold come back into his face. The professional cold, the decision-making cold, the cold that had nothing to do with the October air and everything to do with a message from a contact in Rome that read 4 words and 4 words only. They took someone. Tonight. He looked up at the lit window of the house where his sons were taking their shoes off, and his phone was still in his hand, and he understood, with the finality of someone who has just run out of time, that the choice he had been delaying, the choice between the empire he had spent his life building and the family he had built without knowing it, was no longer something he could defer. It was here. It was tonight. The message said, "They took someone. Tonight." And Tommaso stood at Lucia's gate for 4 seconds reading it, Then he called the number back and it rang 6 times and went to voicemail, and that told him more than the message had. He called Marco. "I saw," Marco said before Tommaso could speak. "Who?" "Ricci." They grabbed him outside the hotel around 9. 2 cars, professional, clean. No witnesses worth anything. Ricci was Tommaso's logistics coordinator, the man who had managed the practical architecture of the search for Lucia, the man who had booked the hotel in Cascais and arranged the rental flat, and coordinated Marco's presence, and done it all with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing this work for 15 years. He was also, which was the relevant fact right now, the man who knew exactly where Lucia's house was, who knew the boys' school, who knew the schedule. "How long ago?" Tommaso said. "Hour, maybe. We only just confirmed it. They'll move fast. They won't wait for leverage to develop. They'll use him as a pressure instrument immediately." He was thinking in the flat operational register that fear produced in him when he applied sufficient force to it from the outside. "Get the car. Don't come here. Meet me at the port." "And the woman? I'm handling that." He hung up and stood at the gate and looked at the lit window for a moment that cost him something, and then he went back up the path and knocked on the door. Lucia opened it before the knock finished. She had not gone to sit down. She had been standing in the hallway, which meant she had heard his phone call through the door, and had been listening, which meant she already knew most of it. She looked at his face and read the rest. "Come in," she said. He came in. The house was warm, which surprised him every time. The specific warmth of a house that has been made into a home by someone who understood the difference. The boys were in the back. He could hear them through a half-open door, the low voices of children winding down toward bed. "Ricci," she said. "You heard." "Enough." She crossed her arms, not defensively. It was a thinking posture. He had learned to read the difference. He knows everything. Yes. Schedule, school, everything. Yes. She absorbed this with the stillness that was not calm, but was what she did instead of panic. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Hours, maybe. They'll want to use him quickly before I can move." "Move where?" "I need to get you out of Cascais tonight. All 3 of you." She looked at him. "That's your solution. Move us again. It's the only immediate option." "Tommaso." Her voice was quiet and deliberate. "We are not going to spend our lives moving. That's not a solution. That's just a postponement with luggage." "I understand that. But right now, tonight, the operational reality, don't." She uncrossed her arms. "Don't do the operational reality voice with me. I'm not one of your people. I don't need to be managed." He stopped, looked at her. "You're right. I'm sorry." The apology surprised them both slightly. She recovered first. "Tell me what's actually happening," she said. "Not the managed version, the real one." He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. He put his phone on the table and his hands flat beside it, and he looked at them for a moment, and she read this. The rare act of him composing himself before speaking, rather than speaking from the position of already being composed. "The Calabrese family has been looking for a pressure point for 3 years," he said. "I've been expanding into logistics networks they consider their territory. They can't come at me directly. The consequences would be too broad, too expensive. It would destabilize arrangements that benefit everyone. So they've been looking for something they could use instead." He paused. "They found it." "Us," she said. "You. Specifically, you. Because I've been looking for you for 5 years, and that search left a trail, and anyone watching me long enough saw what it meant. That I would do things for your safety that I wouldn't do for anything else." She pulled a chair out and sat across from him. The table between them was small, the kind of table that holds a family's meals, nicked at the corners, with a ring stain where someone had set a mug without a coaster. He looked at it briefly, and she saw him see it, and she saw him understand what it represented. "So what do they want?" she said. "They'll want me to withdraw from the Northern Logistics Network, return what I've built over 3 years, hand back territory, contracts, infrastructure, effectively undo everything I've done since the expansion started." He met her eyes. Or they'll make it clear, without saying it directly, that the cost of not doing so will be paid by people who can't protect themselves. Us. You. And if you comply, then they know it works, and they use it again, and then the next family who wants something uses it, and it becomes the mechanism. Forever. She nodded slowly. And if you don't comply? He was quiet. Tommaso. I don't know yet, he said. I'm trying to figure that out. She looked at him across the table with the kitchen lamp between them and the sounds of her sons from the back room, and she said, with the specificity of someone who has been thinking more clearly than the other person in the room, then here's what I need you to understand. The boys cannot be used, not as leverage, not as a bargaining chip, not as a consequence. I don't care what it costs you or what arrangement you have to make. That cannot happen. I know. Say it like you mean it. He looked at her directly. They cannot be used. I will not allow it. And what does not allowing it look like, concretely, tonight? He picked up his phone. It looks like moving you to a safer location while I deal with the Calabrese situation from the outside. Define safer. A house I own outside Sintra. It's not connected to my name. It's held through 4 layers of corporate structure. Nobody from the Calabrese network should be able to trace it in less than 48 hours, and 48 hours is enough time. For what? For me to get Ricci back and renegotiate the terms of the conversation. She studied him. Renegotiate meaning? He didn't answer that one, which was its own kind of answer. She sat with it for a moment. Then she stood up. I'll pack a bag for the boys, 20 minutes. 15 would be better. Then don't waste time talking to me. They were in the car by 11. The boys were half asleep in the back seat, confused and uncomplaining in the way of children who have been pulled from bed and told something is happening and have decided provisionally to trust that the adults have it covered. Marco drove. Tommaso sat in front. Lucia sat in the back between her sons with a bag at her feet, and her hands very still in her lap, and her eyes tracking the road behind them through the rear window with the systematic attention of someone who had spent 5 years developing a habit of knowing when she was followed. She watched the road for 20 minutes before she was satisfied. Then she looked at the back of Tommaso's head, and she thought about what he had not answered when she asked what renegotiating meant. And she thought about the 5 years of operational habits she had observed in him, the way he processed threat, the calculus he applied to consequence. And she thought about her sons asleep against her arms, and she understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in the back seats of cars at midnight, that whatever came next was going to require her to trust him in a way she had not trusted him in 5 years. She was not sure she could do it. She was not sure she had a choice. The house outside Sintra was old, white-walled, set back from a narrow road behind a stand of cork oaks that made it invisible from the outside. It had been furnished minimally. A few beds, a kitchen with basics, the quality of a place that was maintained against occasional use. Lucia looked at it and understood it for what it was. One of several such properties, distributed across several countries, maintained for exactly this kind of evening. She put the boys to bed in a room with 2 narrow cots, and they went without argument, which told her they were more frightened than they were showing. She came back to the kitchen where Tommaso was on the phone, speaking in the abbreviated language of operational instruction, numbers and times and locations, nothing that would mean anything to anyone intercepting who didn't already know the context. He finished and set the phone down and looked up. Ricci is in a warehouse outside Almada, he said. We have a location. How? A contact in the Calabrese support network, someone who owes me a longer debt than they owe the Calabreses a loyalty. And you trust this? Enough to move on it. She sat down at the kitchen table. What are you going to do? Get him out, and then have a conversation with Enzo Calabrese about the boundaries of acceptable pressure. A conversation. A definitive one. She looked at him. Tommaso, I need you to understand something about what happens in this house tonight. My sons are sleeping in the next room. If something goes wrong, if whatever you're planning goes wrong, they are in a property that is connected through 4 layers to you, and your world will be in those 4 layers. Nothing is going to go wrong. That is the single most useless thing you could say to me right now. Her voice did not rise. Don't tell me nothing will go wrong. Tell me what you're going to do if it does." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific effort of a man who is not accustomed to admitting the architecture of his own contingencies, he said, "Marco stays here. He does not leave this property regardless of what I tell him. If I don't make contact by 6 a.m., he takes you and the boys to a location only he knows, and he does not tell me where it is." She looked at Marco, who was standing near the door with his hands in his coat pockets. Marco said, "That's right." She looked back at Tommaso. "Go," she said. He stood up. He picked up his phone and his coat, and he looked at her across the kitchen table. The same look she had been trying not to name since the harbor. The one that was not a tactic and not a performance. The one that was just him, without the architecture, looking at her. And then he went. She listened to the car leave. She sat at the table for a while. Then she got up and checked on the boys. They were asleep, Leonardo on his back with one arm over his eyes in a posture he'd had since infancy. Matteo curled on his side with his knees pulled up. She stood in the doorway and looked at them and felt the specific compound of terror and love that she had been living inside for 5 years and that she suspected now was simply going to be the permanent condition of being their mother. She went back to the kitchen, made coffee she didn't want, sat down and opened her laptop because work was reliable when nothing else was, and tried to focus on a translation contract that was due on Friday and found that the words kept sliding past without sticking. At 2 a.m, Marco's phone rang. She looked up. Marco listened. His face, which had been professionally still, did something she couldn't read. He said 3 words. Understood. Yes, and how bad. And then he hung up and looked at her. They got Ricci out, he said. And? There's a problem. He said it carefully, in the manner of a man who is deciding how much information to deliver and in what sequence. She recognized this and did not have the patience for it. What kind of problem? She said. The warehouse. When they went in, Ricci wasn't the only one there. She waited. There was a woman, Marco said. She'd been there longer. The Calabrese people were using her separately. Different leverage, different situation. She wasn't connected to Ricci or to Tommaso's network. Lucia sat very still. Something in the way Marco was delivering this, the sequence, the care, the way he had not yet said the name she was beginning to understand was coming, was producing a cold in her that had nothing to do with the October night. Who? She said. Marco looked at her with the expression of someone doing something they considered genuinely unkind. Her name is Valentina Verisi, he said. The Calabrese family picked her up in Rome 2 weeks ago. They've been using her as a secondary pressure instrument, insurance, in case the primary approach through Ricci didn't move Tommaso quickly enough. The kitchen was very quiet. My sister, Lucia said. Yes. She sat with this for a long moment. The clock above the sink counted seconds. Outside, the cork oaks moved in the Atlantic wind. Is she hurt? Lucia said. She's alive, some injuries. Nothing she won't recover from. Where is she now? With Tommaso. He's bringing her here. Lucia stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the dark garden, the cork oaks, the absence of anything beyond the property's edge. She put one hand on the window frame and stood there. Valentina. 5 years of not saying the name except in private, in the careful inventory she did of the damage, adding up what she had lost, organizing it, trying to understand the scale. 5 years of managing what she felt about it by keeping it at the correct analytical distance. 5 years of telling herself she had processed it. She had not processed it. She understood this now, standing at the window of a safe house outside Sintra with her sons asleep in the next room, understanding that Valentina Verisi was 20 minutes away in a car with the man they had shared, in 2 entirely different ways, at entirely different costs, and that she was going to have to be in the same room with her sister before morning. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She gave herself 30 seconds. She counted. What? The car came at 3:15. She heard the tires on the gravel and the engine cut and the door, and then voices. Tommaso's, low and instructing, and another man's, and then a third voice, thinner, with the specific quality of someone who has been frightened for a long time and is not yet certain the frightening is over. She recognized the voice. She was standing in the kitchen doorway when they came in. Tommaso first, reading the room in one pass the way he always did, finding her face. Then two men she didn't know. And then Valentina. Her sister was 29 now. She looked older. She was wearing someone else's jacket, too large, dark, wrapped around herself. And her hair was matted on one side and she had a cut above her left eyebrow that had been treated, but not well. She walked in the way of someone whose ribs had been introduced to something hard, the compensating shift in posture that hides pain as structural adjustment. She saw Lucia. She stopped. The two women looked at each other across the width of a safe-house kitchen in Portugal at 3 a.m, and the space between them was 5 years long and contained everything they had never said. Valentina said, "Lucia." Her voice broke on the second syllable. Lucia said nothing. Tommaso looked at Lucia with a question he did not ask aloud. She read it and gave him nothing, and he made the correct decision, which was to take the two men and Marco through to the other room. The kitchen was empty now, except for the two of them. Valentina took one step forward and stopped, as if testing the air for hostility. She had always done this, read rooms by moving into them incrementally, withdrawing if necessary. Lucia had once admired this quality in her. She had thought it was social intelligence. She understood now it was the instinct of someone who had learned very early that rooms were either safe or not safe, and that the judgment needed to be made quickly. "I didn't know where you were," Valentina said. "I want you to know that. I never knew." Tommaso looked. I know he looked. But I never told him anything because I didn't know anything. "I know," Lucia said. "I have been trying to find a way to Valentina. Her name in Lucia's mouth, with 5 years of weight behind it. "Don't." Valentina flinched. It was a small movement, very controlled. "I need to say it. I know you do, and I am telling you that tonight is not the night." "Then when?" Her voice cracked on this, and she did not try to hold it. "When is the night, Lucia? I have been waiting 5 years for a moment to— My sons are asleep in that room." Lucia's voice was quiet and absolute. "They are 5 years old, and they have had a frightening night, and I am not going to have this conversation with you 15 feet from where they're sleeping." Valentina closed her mouth. "You're going to sit down," Lucia said. "You're going to let someone look at that cut properly. You're going to drink something and be warm and be safe because you are my sister and you are in my house, and whatever I feel about you does not change that." She paused. "And in the morning, when my sons are awake and settled and the immediate situation is managed, we will talk. You will say what you need to say. I will say what I need to say. And we will see what's left." Valentina sat down at the kitchen table. She sat there with the borrowed jacket around her shoulders and the cut above her eye and the careful way she held herself that was about the ribs. And she looked at her older sister, and her eyes were doing what they had always done when she was genuinely frightened rather than performatively. Going very still, the tears held back by the simple force of not blinking. Lucia filled the kettle. She made tea she didn't want for a sister she didn't know how to feel about. In a kitchen that wasn't hers, in a country she had chosen because it was far enough from everyone who had hurt her, at 3 a.m, while her sons slept and her son's father stood in the next room dealing with the consequences of a world she had tried for 5 years to stay outside of. She set the mug in front of Valentina. Valentina wrapped her hands around it the same way Lucia had wrapped her hands around the espresso cup at the cafe 3 weeks ago. Lucia looked at this and then looked away. She sat down across from her sister. Outside, Tommaso's voice came through the wall, low, controlled, the tone of someone issuing instructions that were not negotiable. She listened to the cadence without hearing the words, and she felt, in a way she had been resisting since the harbor, the full weight of where she was. The center of a crisis she had not caused and could not fully control, surrounded by the people who had damaged her most, responsible for 2 lives that were entirely hers, and completely, irrevocably out of the clean distance she had maintained for 5 years. She was no longer watching from a careful remove. She was inside it. And the thing she understood, sitting at that table with her sister's hands wrapped around a mug and her sons breathing quietly through a wall, and Tommaso's voice low and certain from the next room, was that she had been inside it since the moment on the harbor path when a 5-year-old boy stopped and looked at a man on a bench and said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to protect himself from the truth, "You have the same nose as me." She had been inside it since then. She had simply not admitted it yet. And now, in this kitchen, at this hour, with all of them gathered by the specific gravity of everything that had happened and everything that could not be undone, she admitted it. And the admission was not a relief, and it was not a surrender. It was the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Portuguese prefix. She picked it up. The voice on the other end was male, accented, unhurried in the way of someone who knows they have the advantage and is not in a hurry to use it all at once. "Senora Marquez," he said. The false name, which meant they knew the false name, which meant they knew more than Ricci had been able to tell them, which meant the source of their information was somewhere she had not yet identified. Or should I say Signora Verisi, the real one, not the younger one. We finished with her. You. Lucia said nothing. "We have a message for Signor Silvestri, but we thought it would be more effective coming through you, since you have his attention in a way that his people do not." A pause. "Tell him that the offer expires at dawn. After dawn, the terms change, and the new terms are not about territory." "Well, what are the new terms?" she said. Her voice was completely flat. "The new terms," the man said, "are about what happens to the people in that house when we stop being patient." The line went dead. Lucia set the phone down on the table. Valentina was looking at her. Tommaso appeared in the doorway a second later, reading her face, and what he saw there brought him fully into the room with the specific quality of attention that meant he had understood that something had shifted in the last 30 seconds. "They called you," he said, "on my personal number." She looked at him. "Tommaso. Someone told them this number. Someone told them that name. Someone inside your operation told them exactly where to find us and exactly how to reach me." The silence in the kitchen had a new quality now. He looked at Marco, who was behind him in the doorway, and Marco looked back, and the look between them was the look of two people arriving simultaneously at a conclusion they did not want to be correct. "Who knew this number?" Tommaso said to Marco. His voice was very quiet. Marco's jaw tightened. 4 people. Me, Ricci, Costa, and... He stopped. Lucia watched Tommaso's face do something she had seen it do only once before. In the early months, when a man he had trusted absolutely had demonstrated through a single administrative error that the trust had been misplaced. The specific expression of someone who is located within the architecture of their own certainty, the exact place where it was hollow. "Say the name," Tommaso said. Marco said the name. And Tommaso Silvestri, who had not been caught off guard by anything in 5 years, stood in the doorway of a safe house kitchen and understood that the person who had given the Calabrese family everything they needed, the location, the number, the name, the access, was not an enemy he had failed to identify. It was someone who had been inside his organization for 15 years, someone he had brought into his confidence completely, someone who knew, therefore, not just where Lucia was tonight, but everything. Every property, every contact, every layer of protection, every exit. The dawn was 4 hours away, and the terms were changing, and the man he had trusted most in the world had been the source of everything that was closing in on them. And Lucia was looking at him from across the kitchen table with her sister beside her, and her sons through the wall, and the expression on her face was not fear. It was the particular expression of someone who has just been confirmed in a thing they hoped was not true, waiting to see what the person responsible for their situation is going to do about it. He looked at her. "I need you to trust me," he said. It was the worst possible thing to say. He knew it as he said it. And he said it anyway because it was the only true thing he had. The name Marco said was Costa. Domenico Costa. 51 years old, 15 years inside Tommaso's operation. Starting as a driver, moving through logistics, finance, coordination, until he occupied the specific position of someone who knew everything and was trusted with everything because he had been there long enough that trust had become assumption, the kind of trust that stops being examined because it has become structural, the way you stop checking whether the floor will hold you. Tommaso stood in the doorway and said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Where is he now?" Marco said, "Rome. He hasn't moved. He thinks we don't know." "He's wrong." Tommaso was already pulling his phone out. "Get Ferraro. Get him on a plane in the next hour. Tell him nothing on the phone, just that I need him in Lisbon before dawn." "Ferraro's in Naples. Then he has a long hour. Move." Marco moved. Tommaso looked at Lucia across the kitchen. She had not moved from the table. Valentina was beside her, both hands around the mug, watching him with the specific attention of someone who is trying to determine whether the person in front of them is going to be adequate to the situation. 15 years, Lucia said. "Yes. He knew about me. He knew about the boys. He knew everything I knew." "Which means the Calabrese family knows everything." "Yes." He said it plainly, without softening, because she had told him not to soften things, and he was finally learning to listen to her. "Which means the property, this address, is compromised. We need to move within the hour." "Move where?" Her voice was tired. Not weak, a specific category of exhausted that is different from defeat. The exhaustion of someone who has been managing an escalating crisis since 10 o'clock and has been doing it well, and is now being asked to do more. "You said this property was protected through 4 layers. Costa set up 2 of those layers." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Where?" she said again. "There's a boat. In the Cascas Marina. It's held under a name that Costa didn't set up. It goes back to before him. It's the one piece of infrastructure he doesn't have access to." "A boat," she said. "It has a cabin. It's docked. We're not going anywhere on the water tonight. It's just a location they can't trace in the time they have." She stood up. "I'll wake the boys. Lucia, don't thank me. Just make sure we're not followed." She went to the back room. He heard her voice, low and even, waking them. Not with alarm, with the measured tone of a mother who needs her children to trust her in a moment that requires trust. He heard Leonardo's voice, questioning, and her answer, and then the sounds of children being dressed in the middle of the night with the pragmatic speed of someone who has decided that questions can come later. He stood in the kitchen and called Ferraro and said 4 sentences and hung up, and then stood with his phone in his hand looking at the table where Lucia had been sitting, at the 2 mugs, at the ring of moisture from the base of Valentina's cup, at the ordinary evidence of people who had been sitting still while the world outside contracted around them. Valentina said, from the table, "She's going to be all right." He looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since the warehouse, and the first time in 5 years before that, and the look lasted exactly as long as necessary. "I know." "She's stronger than she was. She was always strong." Valentina looked down at her mug. "She was always strong. I just didn't take care of it." He had nothing to say to this that was useful, so he said nothing, and she appeared to prefer that. And then Lucia came back with a boy on each side of her, and both boys in coats, and Leonardo carrying his bird notebook under his arm, because of course he was, and Matteo with a piece of pipe fitting in his jacket pocket, because he was 5 and it was his current most important object, and no one was going to take it from him in the middle of the night. "Ready?" Lucia said. He looked at her. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "Let's go." The marina at 4 in the morning was as close to empty as a marina ever gets. A few lights on distant boats, the slap of water against hulls, the smell of brine and diesel, and the particular cold that lives near the ocean at the end of October. Marco drove them in. A second car, Ferraro's advance man, was already there. A detail Tommaso had arranged in the 4 minutes between the phone call and leaving the safe house. The boat was a 40-foot motor cruiser, white, unremarkable among the other vessels, with a name on the stern that Lucia didn't look at closely and would not remember. They went aboard in the dark, Tommaso lifting the boys across the gap from the dock without ceremony, Lucia stepping across herself without waiting for assistance, Valentina last, moving carefully around her ribs. The cabin below was functional. A table, seating along the sides, a small galley, 2 berths at the forward end. Lucia settled the boys on 1 berth with their coats still on, and Matteo was asleep again within 4 minutes with the pipe fitting still in his pocket, and Leonardo lasted 6 minutes more before the bird notebook fell from his loosening hand and his breathing went slow. She came back to the main cabin. Tommaso was at the table with a phone and a chart, and Marco standing across from him. He looked up. "Ferraro lands in 40 minutes, he said. "He'll come directly here. I need 2 hours to set up what I need to set up. And then I go deal with Costa. From here. From here. I'm not leaving you on this boat alone. There'll be people on the dock who... I didn't ask for... Lucia." His voice was steady and specific. "This is not me managing you. This is the practical reality. If I leave this boat unprotected and the Calabrese people locate it in the next 2 hours, which is possible, you are on a boat with 2 children and 1 injured woman and no exit that doesn't involve the water. I'm not leaving this boat unprotected. That is not a negotiation." She looked at him for a moment. "Fine," she said. He turned back to the chart. She sat at the far end of the table and watched him work and thought about what trust looked like in practice, as distinct from what it felt like in theory. In theory, trust was a decision, a posture toward another person, a willingness to accept risk on the basis of evidence. In practice, at 4 a.m. on a boat in a Portuguese marina, with her sons asleep in the next compartment, and a man who had destroyed her life once sitting 3 feet away, trust felt like something much more physical, like standing on a surface you weren't certain would hold you, and choosing not to step back onto ground you already knew was solid. She was standing on it. She was not stepping back. Ferraro arrived at 4:52, boarded without announcement, and sat down across from Tommaso with the contained urgency of a man who had been woken, dressed, and flown across a country in under 2 hours and was professional enough to treat this as normal. He was around 60, compact, with the white hair and the careful eyes of someone who had spent a long career at the exact intersection of information and consequence. Tommaso told him about Costa in 4 minutes. Ferraro listened without interrupting, which was one of the qualities that had made him useful for 20 years. When Tommaso finished, Ferraro said, "How do you want to handle it?" "I want Costa to believe he still has time. I want him to make the call he's been building toward, the one where he tells the Calabrese people that we're contained and they can proceed. I want that call to happen in a location where I can control what happens next." "And you want me to arrange the location?" "I want you to arrange everything." Ferraro nodded. "The call will happen in the next hour. He's been waiting for confirmation that the offer expired and we didn't comply. When that confirmation doesn't come, he'll start to wonder, and wondering will make him act." A pause. "I can bring him to you. But the conversation with the Calabreses, that's separate. That needs to happen simultaneously or they move on the alternative plan." "I know." Tommaso looked at the chart on the table. "The alternative plan is this boat." "Yes." "Then we have one shot at the timing." "Yes." Lucia from the far end of the table. "Who handles the Calabreses?" Both men looked at her. "The simultaneous conversation," she said. "Ferraro just said you can't handle both at once. Costa is one. The Calabreses are the other. Who handles the Calabreses?" Tommaso looked at Ferraro. Ferraro looked at the table. "That's what I thought," Lucia said. She looked at Tommaso. "You don't have anyone else." "I have options." "Name one that doesn't take longer than you have." He was quiet. "You need someone who can be in the room with Enzo Calabrese," she said, "and make him believe that the arrangement he's been building toward is not in his interest. You need someone who can do that in the next 2 hours without being one of your people, because all of your people are now potentially compromised by what Costa knew." Tommaso said, "Lucia, I speak 5 languages," she said. "I have spent 15 years translating what people mean from what they say. I know how to read a room and I know how to manage a conversation, and I know exactly how men like Enzo Calabrese think because I spent 2 years watching exactly how men like Enzo Calabrese think." She looked at him across the table. "And I am not one of your people. I am not connected to you professionally. I am a translator named Lucia Marquez who has been caught in the middle of someone else's dispute and who has a very specific set of things she wants and is prepared to negotiate for them." The cabin was very quiet. Ferraro looked at Tommaso with the specific expression of a man who has just heard an unexpected solution proposed and is calculating its viability. Tommaso looked at Lucia. No, he said, that's not your decision. You're the mother of my children, which is exactly why I am making this decision and not you. She did not raise her voice. You think putting me in that room is the risk? I'm telling you that leaving me on this boat while the situation is unresolved is the risk. I'm not asking your permission, Tommaso. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The boat moved gently on the water. From the forward berth, one of the boys made a small sound in his sleep and settled again. Tommaso looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Ferraro. Arrange the meeting, he said. Touch set. Enzo Calabrese met her in a hotel bar in Lisbon at 6:15 in the morning, which told her two things: that he had been expecting contact, and that he was not a man who slept when he was waiting for something. He was 60, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had the quality of old stone, features that had been worked by weather and decisions, and the specific gravity of a life lived in the management of consequences. He was drinking coffee, and he did not stand when she sat down, which was its own kind of information. She sat across from him without waiting to be invited, because waiting to be invited ceded ground she needed. You're not who I expected, he said, in Italian. She answered in Italian without acknowledging the implicit question. No, I'm not. She set her hands flat on the table, unhurried. I'm also not here to threaten you or make promises I'm not in a position to keep. I'm here to give you information that I think changes your calculation, and then you can decide what to do with it. He looked at her with the professional assessment of a man who has been reading people for 40 years. You're the woman. I'm a woman, the specific one you've been using as a pressure mechanism, yes. And your children are sleeping safely. She held his eyes, which is the first piece of information I want you to have. Whatever your people told you about the leverage, it's not where you think it is. He was quiet, which meant he was listening, which was enough. Costa has been feeding you information, she said. For how long? I don't know. That's not my area. But I can tell you that the information he has been feeding you has been curated to serve a specific purpose. And that purpose is not your interest or Tommaso's. It's his. He's been positioning himself to inherit the Northern Logistics Network when your action against Tommaso forces him out. You are never going to get the network. You are going to clear the way for someone who told you he was your instrument. She watched the calculation move across his face. I can prove this, she said. I don't have the documentation with me, because I'm not a fool and neither are you. But within the next 2 hours, Ferraro is going to deliver Costa to a conversation that will produce documentation, and you can verify it through your own sources before you decide what to do. She paused. The question you have to answer before then is whether the arrangement you've built with Costa is worth defending when you understand what you are actually building. Enzo Calabrese set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who was not surprised to have been deceived, who had been deceived before and had developed, over the decades, a particular relationship with the feeling, and who was now conducting in real time the assessment of whether the deception was reversible or simply a cost to be absorbed. What does Silvestri want? He said. He wants his family left alone. And in exchange, the Northern Network stays where it is, no withdrawal, but he's willing to negotiate joint logistics access on 2 of the secondary routes, the ones that actually create revenue rather than the ones that create territory. He's not interested in the territory argument. He's interested in the revenue argument. She held his eyes, which means you're both getting something you actually want instead of spending the next year and a significant amount of money fighting about something neither of you actually needs. Calabrese was quiet. The hotel bar was empty except for a bartender at the far end who was professionally not listening. He sent a translator, Calabrese said, finally. He sent the mother of his children, she said, which is the other piece of information I want you to have, because it tells you something about where his priorities are. And where his priorities are tells you something about what he will and will not do to protect what matters to him. She stood up. You have 2 hours, she said. After that, the documentation exists regardless of what you decide, and the conversation it starts is one that doesn't include an offer. She walked to the door. Signora, Calabrese said. She stopped. He knows what he has, Calabrese said. She turned enough to look at him over her shoulder. He's learning, she said. She walked out. Wets. The morning came up gray and cold off the Atlantic, the kind of dawn that doesn't arrive so much as accumulate. A slow lightening of the water, the boats in the marina taking shape from darkness, the city behind them emerging in flat blocks against the white sky. Lucia sat on the deck of the boat with her coat pulled tight and her hands around a thermos of coffee that Marco had produced from somewhere, and she watched the light come, and she felt the specific exhaustion of the last 18 hours settling into her bones the way cold settles into stone, gradually, completely, until it is indistinguishable from the structure itself. Her phone buzzed. Ferraro. Costa is in the room. 30 minutes. She typed back, Calabrese will wait for the documentation. He's not going to move until he sees it. Ferraro. Understood. She set the phone on her knee. Behind her from the cabin, she heard one of the boys wake up. The sounds of a child oriented, disoriented, reoriented. Then Valentina's voice, low and competent, answering a question she couldn't hear, then quiet again. She sat with this, her sister's voice, from the next room, soothing her son, and she sat with the complicated thing it did to her, and she did not try to resolve it. She simply let it exist. Tommaso came up from the cabin at 6:45. He stood beside her on the deck and looked at the water and did not ask how the meeting went because Ferraro would have told him. You should have told me you were going to do that, he said. You would have said no. I did say no. After, she said, which is different. He was quiet for a moment. How was he? Manageable. He's a practical man. He doesn't want a war any more than you do. He wants the revenue and the face saving and someone to blame for the miscalculation. Costa is going to be very useful to him in that regard. Costa is going to have other problems. I know. She looked at the water. I didn't ask what happens to Costa. I don't want to know. That's probably right. It's definitely right. She wrapped both hands around the thermos. Tommaso, after today, when this is finished and whatever you do to resolve it is done, I need you to understand something about what happens next. Tell me. I'm not going back into the life I had before I left. I'm not going back to being beside you the way I was, adjacent to your world, dependent on your protection, understanding that the cost of your love was accepting permanent proximity to the consequences of how you built it. He said nothing. But I'm also not going to pretend that the last 3 weeks haven't happened, she said. I'm not going to pretend that what you've been with the boys isn't what it is. I'm not going to make them pay for what happened between us. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't know yet. I'm saying that I need you to give me the time to figure it out without pressure, without strategy, without the version of you that wants something and moves toward it and assumes wanting it hard enough is the same as deserving it. He turned to look at her. I'm saying... She stopped, started again. I'm saying that there is something here that I haven't finished deciding about yet, and I need you to be patient with the deciding. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long time. The light was coming up behind her and the water was moving, and his face had the quality it had on the harbor bench, undefended, unheld, just the actual thing. Yes, he said. Her phone buzzed. Ferraro. He's talking. You need to hear this. She looked at the screen and then at Tommaso. Ferraro needs you. He didn't move immediately. Go, she said. He went below. She sat with the thermos and the gray morning and the sound of the water and the sound of her son's voices beginning to come up from the cabin, and she sat with everything that was unresolved and everything that was, despite everything, present, and she allowed herself, just for the length of a breath, to feel how much she had built in 5 years. And then her phone rang again. Not Ferraro's number. The unknown number. The same one. She looked at it for 2 full rings. Then she answered. The voice was different this time. Not the measured, patient voice from the night before. This one was tighter, controlled in the way of someone applying significant effort to the control. You made a mistake, the voice said. Going to Calabrese directly. He called us an hour ago and told us the arrangement was suspended pending verification, which means you have bought yourself time, but not safety. A pause. And it means we are no longer patient. She heard something in the background of the call, a sound she recognized before she understood she was recognizing it. A child's voice. Not from the cabin below her. From the phone. Her vision went very still. The world reduced to the rectangle of the phone in her hand and the sound coming through it and the cold morning air on her face. "Leonardo," she said. The line was silent for 2 seconds. Then her son's voice, very steady for a 5-year-old, said, "Mama." And then the call cut. She was already moving, already pulling the cabin door open, already going down the steps before the call had fully ended, and she hit the bottom of the steps and looked at the forward berth and saw Matteo sitting up, blinking, alone, Valentina beside him, with her face doing something that told Lucia everything before she could ask. Valentina said, "He went up to the deck 20 minutes ago. I thought he was with you." Lucia did not respond. She was already back up the steps, already on the deck, already looking at the dock and the marina and the gray October morning with the specific focus of someone whose entire sensory system has been redirected toward a single purpose. The dock was empty in both directions. The marina was quiet. A man in an orange vest was working on a boat 3 slips down, unhurried, paying attention to his own business. She looked at every face she could see. None of them were Leonardo's. She went below and looked at Tommaso, and he read her face and was standing before she spoke. "Leonardo," she said. "He's gone. Someone called me. He was on the call." Tommaso was already moving. He said 2 things to Marco, a location name and a description, and Marco was on his phone before Tommaso reached the steps. He came up to the deck beside Lucia and stood very still for 3 seconds, scanning the marina with the systematic attention of someone doing an assessment rather than panicking, and she stood beside him and did the same because panic was a resource expenditure and she did not have resources to spare. "The call came from the unknown number," she said. "The same one. They said they were no longer patient." "How long ago?" 4 minutes. "They're not out of the marina yet." He said this with the flat certainty of someone doing math rather than hoping. On foot with a child, 4 minutes, they're still in the immediate area. In a car, they could be on the road, but not far. He pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds and consisted entirely of an address, a description, and the words moving now, child, 5 years old, dark coat, do not approach, locate only. Then he looked at Lucia. "Stay with Matteo," he said. "No." "Lucia, no." She said it the way she said the things that were not negotiable. "He is my son. I am not staying on this boat." He looked at her for 1 second. Then he said, "Stay with me. Don't run ahead. Then don't fall behind." They went. The marina had 3 exits, 2 pedestrian gates and a vehicle access point at the northern end. Tommaso's people were covering the vehicle exit within 3 minutes of the call. Marco had the southern pedestrian gate. That left the northern pedestrian gate, which opened onto a street that ran along the waterfront toward the older part of Cascais. The narrow streets and the market and the places where a man with a child could disappear into the foot traffic of a morning that was slowly beginning to fill with ordinary people doing ordinary things. Tommaso went north. Lucia stayed beside him, matching his pace, which was fast without running. The deliberate speed of people who cannot afford to be seen running because running signals crisis and crisis draws attention they didn't want. She was aware of everything. The cold air moving in off the water, the sound of her own breathing, the weight of the phone in her coat pocket, the specific quality of the morning light on the wet cobblestones, the way it flattened shadows and made distances harder to read. She was aware of all of it with the heightened, almost uncomfortable clarity of extreme adrenaline, and she used it, cataloging every person she passed, every doorway, every parked vehicle, every gap between buildings. Tommaso's phone buzzed. He looked at it without breaking stride. He changed direction without explaining, and she changed direction with him, reading the redirect from the angle of his turn, and they went right down a narrow street that she recognized as running parallel to the market. Halfway down the street, she saw them. A man, heavy-set, moving quickly with a child beside him. The child's hand was in the man's hand, and the man's grip had the quality of a grip that is not invited. Leonardo was walking fast to keep up, not running, and his face when she saw it, the angle, the particular set of his jaw, had the expression she recognized as the face he made when he was frightened and was refusing, through sheer inherited stubbornness, to show it. She said his name, not loud, but with everything in it. Leonardo's head turned. The man turned at the same time, and in the half-second of his turn, Tommaso was already moving. Not running, not telegraphing, just closing distance with the specific efficiency of someone who has done this before and knows that the first 3 seconds are everything. The man saw him coming and made the calculation that most people make incorrectly, which was to hold on to what he had rather than release it, and that calculation cost him the half-second he needed. Tommaso reached him. What happened in the next 15 seconds was brief and not elegant, and left the man sitting against the wall of the narrow street with the specific posture of someone who has had the decision made for them by their body rather than their mind, and Leonardo standing free, and Lucia on her knees on the wet cobblestones with her arms around her son before she was conscious of having crossed the distance. Leonardo did not cry. He was shaking. She could feel it through his coat, the fine tremor of a body that has been managing fear for a period longer than it should have had to. But he did not cry. He pressed his face against her shoulder, and she held the back of his head, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than the fact of being there, being solid, being the thing he could push against. "I knew you'd come," he said. His voice was muffled against her shoulder. "Always," she said. She held him. Tommaso was on the phone behind her, low and fast, and she heard him say the street name, and then she heard him say contained, and she heard him say, "I need the other conversation completed in the next 30 minutes, or the documentation releases automatically." And she understood that the parallel operation, Costa, Calabrese, the documentation, was still running while she knelt on wet cobblestones and held her son and felt the shaking in him slowly, incrementally, stop. She became aware that her knees hurt. She became aware that her hands were not entirely steady. She became aware that Leonardo had pulled back enough to look at her face and was doing the thing he did, cataloging her, assessing, running the calculation. "Are you okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You're not crying." "No." "Mama cries when she's very scared sometimes," he said, "but only after." "I know," she said. "I know I do." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked past her at Tommaso, who was finishing the call, and his face did the thing it had done on the harbor bench 3 weeks ago. The direct, undefended assessment. A child taking the measure of a situation with the instruments he had. "He came," Leonardo said. "Yes," she said. "He runs fast." "He does." Leonardo considered this. "Okay," he said. The same provisional okay from 3 weeks ago, but with something added to it. Something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite acceptance, but was in the neighborhood of both. Tommaso crouched down beside them on the cobblestones. He was breathing harder than he would have preferred, and his coat had someone else's problem on the left sleeve, and his face had the expression it made when he was operating on the other side of what fear did to him. Not the cold professional register, but the thing underneath it, the thing he had spent 45 years learning to keep out of his face and was, right now, failing to keep out of his face entirely. He looked at Leonardo. He put one hand on the side of the boy's head, very carefully, the way you touch something you are not certain you have the right to touch. "You did well," he said. "You stayed calm." Leonardo looked at him with serious eyes. "I was scared." "I know. Staying calm when you're scared is the only kind of calm that matters." The boy absorbed this. Then he leaned forward slightly into the hand on the side of his head. It was a very small movement. It was the most important thing that had happened in the last 4 minutes. Lucia watched it happen and felt something shift in her chest. Not break, not open, but move. Like a stone that has been sitting in one position for so long, it has left an impression, being lifted and set down somewhere slightly different. Not gone. Moved. She stood up. Her knees had the cold wet from the cobblestones in them. "Let's go back to the boat," she said. Costa broke in 40 minutes. Ferraro sent the documentation to 3 separate recipients at 9 in the morning, timed to arrive simultaneously, one to Calabresi's primary contact in Rome, one to a journalist who operated in a world adjacent to organized crime and who had been cultivated as an instrument of consequence for exactly this kind of situation, and one to an address in Naples that Tommaso did not explain to anyone. Costa broke before the documentation arrived, which suggested that what Ferraro did in the room with him was sufficiently persuasive without it. This was not a thing Lucia asked about, and it was not a thing Tommaso offered. The relevant fact was that Costa produced in writing a full account of his arrangement with the Calabrese family, the timeline, the specific information he had passed, and the financial structure that had been built to compensate him. This account was witnessed, documented, and became the instrument by which the remaining pieces of the situation were resolved. Calabrese called Tommaso directly at 9:45. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Lucia was not in the room. She was on the deck of the boat with both boys, watching Matteo explain to Leonardo the load distribution problem he had been solving in the garden before the night interrupted everything, using the pipe fitting from his pocket as a demonstration object. Leonardo was listening with the focused attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting, which was most things. She watched her sons and listened to the water and let the morning do what mornings do, which was to continue regardless. When Tommaso came up from the cabin, she read his face before he spoke. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. "Costa. Out of the network. He'll spend the foreseeable future managing that." A pause. "Calabrese agreed to the terms you proposed. Joint access on the secondary routes. He's presenting it as a negotiated realignment, which means he saves face, and I get what I actually wanted, which was to stop spending resources on a territorial dispute that was always about ego more than revenue. And the men who took Leonardo, that's being addressed." She held his eyes. "Tommaso, no one else will touch them. That's what I can tell you. The men involved directly will answer for it through channels that don't require anything from you or from me going forward." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the water. "Is it over?" she said. "The immediate situation?" "Yes." He stood beside her at the deck railing, not close, the careful distance he had maintained. "The larger situation, the organization, the network, the life I built, I've been thinking about that since before any of this happened. Since the first Saturday at the harbor park. Since the first time I sat on the floor with Matteo and a piece of pipe and understood what I had been doing instead of that for 5 years." She waited. "I'm not going to run it the way I've been running it," he said. "I've been making arrangements. It takes time. There are obligations, structures, people who depend on the organization for their livelihood in ways that aren't criminal, and I'm not going to leave those people without provision. But I'm stepping away from the operational center. Ferraro will manage the transition. It'll take 12 months, maybe 18. "And what do you do for 18 months? He looked at her. "I was hoping that was a conversation we could have." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, Leonardo said something to Matteo that made Matteo laugh. A full, unself-conscious sound. The laugh of a child who has forgotten, already, the fear of the previous night, because children have the specific mercy of a present tense that is more powerful than their past. She listened to that laugh. She thought about what she had said to Tommaso on the deck at dawn, that there was something here she hadn't finished deciding about yet. She thought about the 30 seconds she had given herself in the back of a taxi in Milan 5 years ago, forehead against cold glass, watching the city recede, and how she had counted the seconds and then straightened up and started thinking about where to go. She had gone very far. She had built something real. And now the thing she had built existed in the same world as the man she had run from. And the man he had been and the man he was were not the same man, and she was not the same woman, and none of that made the past simple or resolved or paid for. But it was true. "In 18 months, she said slowly, when the arrangements are made. What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that was not evasion. He was finding the honest answer rather than the strategic one, and she could see the effort of it, because the honest answer was not something he was practiced at delivering without it costing him something. "I want to be in the same place as my sons," he said. "I want to know which bird Leonardo is drawing this week, and how the water routing system develops, and what questions Matteo asks at breakfast. I want to be there for the ordinary things. I missed 5 years of ordinary things." He paused. "And I want whatever you're willing to give me. Not more than that. not a demand for more than that. Whatever you decide is available. I want that. She looked at him. The morning had come fully now. The gray had burned off, and the light off the Atlantic was the particular cold gold of an October morning in Portugal. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's been recently washed. The marina was busy around them, ordinary life restoring itself to its proper volume after the contracted silence of the night. "You broke something," she said. 5 years ago, in that apartment. You broke something that was... It was the version of me that believed completely. That gave everything without holding a part back in reserve." She kept her eyes on the water. "I don't know if that version comes back. I don't know if I can build a version of trust that doesn't have the knowledge of that night inside it somewhere." "I know. But..." She turned to look at him, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was being fully honest. Not managed, not performed, just the actual thing. "You came here. You came to this country, and you stood on a bench, and you let a 5-year-old boy tell you that you had the same nose, and you didn't deny it, and you sat on the floor with my sons, and you let me walk into a hotel bar at 6 in the morning and negotiate with a man who frightens most of the people who know him because I asked to, and this morning you ran." He waited. "You ran," she said again, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Something that was not resolved but was no longer contracted against him. "You didn't make a call. You didn't send Marco. You ran. He's my son." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I'm saying. I know." Below them, Matteo called up. "Papa, come and look at this." The word landed in the air between them. Papa. The first time. Unprompted, unrehearsed, the casual, devastating authority of a child who has made a decision and implemented it without consulting anyone. Tommaso looked at her. She looked back. She made a gesture with her chin toward the cabin steps. Small, the kind of gesture that is not a concession or a permission, but is the simple indication that something is waiting for him below and he should go to it. He went. She stood at the railing and listened to his footsteps on the cabin floor, and Matteo's voice launching immediately into an explanation of load distribution that required full attention from the audience. And she looked out at the water, and she let herself feel, for a moment, the full weight of everything. The 5 years, the city she had left, the ring she had set on a conference program, the taxi, the train, the ultrasound image in a Zurich waiting room, the guest house above the laundromat, the 2 narrow cots in Malvera da Serra, the squeaking gate, the bird notebook, the pipe fittings in the garden grass. All of it. She let herself feel it. Valentina left on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the marina. They had the conversation Lucia had promised on the boat. Twice, actually, because the first one didn't finish and the second one finished badly. And they sat in the kitchen of Lucia's house in the evening, after the boys were in bed, and they said the things that had been waiting 5 years for a room to be set in. Valentina did not make excuses. That was the thing Lucia had not expected and could not have predicted. That her sister, who had spent a lifetime finding excuses the way other people found oxygen, would sit across from her at the kitchen table with her hands flat and her eyes direct and say, "I don't have anything that makes it less than what it was. I wanted what you had, and I took it, and I told myself it was more complicated than that, and it wasn't." Lucia sat with this. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Valentina said. "I know what that costs, and I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it." "No," Lucia said. "Not yet." "Not yet," Valentina repeated. Something moved in her face. "Does that mean there's a version of this where—" "I don't know. I genuinely don't know." Lucia looked at her sister across the table. "But you're here. And you didn't lie to me just now, and it's something. It's the beginning of something I don't have a name for yet." Valentina nodded. They sat in the kitchen a little longer without speaking, and it was not comfortable, and it was not resolved, but it was 2 people who were no longer pretending the silence between them was permanent, which was its own kind of progress. When Valentina left, Lucia walked her to the gate. The gate squeaked. Valentina turned at the end of the path and looked back. "Take care of them," she said. "Always," Lucia said. Valentina walked down the street. and Lucia watched her go and felt the specific texture of a grief that is not finished but has been acknowledged, which is a different thing entirely from a grief that has been buried. She went back inside. The months that followed were not easy and were not